My husband, who lives off my income, texted during my board meeting in London, "Why haven't you sent my $5,000 allowance? Want me to get mad and divorce you?" I simply replied, "I divorced you yesterday," and put my phone face down on the mahogany table. The boardroom erupted with the low hum of executives murmuring, but I kept my eyes fixed on the quarterly projections on the screen. My phone began vibrating with a relentless intensity that made the heavy table shake just slightly, but I did not blink. I am Kendra, and I am 35 years old. I am the director of wealth management at a top-tier financial firm, and I have spent the last 4 years being the financial backbone for a family of leeches. Jamal has been calling me nonstop, thinking I am playing some twisted game with his lifestyle funding. He thinks I am just like the woman I was when we first met, a woman who would apologize for being busy and rush to wire him money to keep the peace. He has no idea that the woman he married died a long time ago. I let the phone ring until it stopped, then flipped it over to see 40 missed calls. My hand did not tremble. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. I was in London to close a massive acquisition, a deal that would cement my position in the industry for the next decade. I had been working 80 hours a week for this moment, while Jamal spent his afternoons at the country club networking with people who had no interest in his fake software company. I pulled my phone out and sent a quick email to my assistant in New York to confirm the final lock on the accounts. By the time I turned back around, the boardroom was silent, waiting for my lead. I gave them the most profitable pitch of my career without missing a beat. I had been the one making the money for years while Jamal pretended to be a venture capitalist. I realized 3 months ago that if I wanted a future that was actually mine, I had to stop funding his delusions. I had quietly filed for divorce using a service that notified him through publication while I was on a business trip to Hong Kong. He never read the mail. He never checked his inbox because he was too busy spending my money on clothes he did not need and cars he could not afford. The legal process moved forward quietly without him because he simply did not care enough to respond. He thought I was just busy. He thought I was just the reliable wife who would always be there to bail him out. He was wrong. The divorce was finalized at 9 in the morning Eastern Standard Time yesterday. I had the decree in my briefcase tucked right next to the acquisition contracts. Jamal thinks this is a fight about money, but he is wrong. This is a fight about freedom. He has been riding my coattails for so long he forgot that the coat was actually mine, and I was tired of carrying the weight. I walked back to the table and closed my laptop, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I knew what was waiting for me back in the States. The fallout would be messy and loud, because that was the only way Jamal knew how to function, but I was ready for it. I had anticipated his reaction and prepared for every single move he would make. I had hired security for my apartment, and I had already notified my office security about his attempts to enter the building. I had played the game according to his rules for years, but now I was writing the rules. I looked at the missed calls again and decided it was time to let him know exactly what kind of game he was playing. I hit the call button and put the phone on speaker as I picked up my coat to leave. Jamal picked up before the second ring, and the sound of his heavy breathing filled the room. "You think this is funny?" he screamed into the phone. "You think you can just cut me off and hide assets from me?" I heard his voice crack as the reality of his bank accounts being empty finally hit him. I listened to his pathetic threats and his desperate demands to know where the money had gone. He was still the same man who had spilled coffee on me in college, pretending it was an accident when it was a clumsy attempt at charm. That charm had worn off years ago. I did not raise my voice, and I did not try to explain myself because explanations were for people who still cared what the other person thought. "I am not hiding anything, Jamal," I said, my voice sounding cold even to my own ears. "I am just reclaiming my life. You had a house, a car, and an allowance that was more than most people make in a year. You had it all, and you chose to throw it away by assuming I would always be your meal ticket." He started yelling about his lawyer again, about how his sister Keisha and her husband Trent were going to destroy me in court. I laughed then, a genuine sound of amusement that I am sure infuriated him. Trent has spent his entire career in real estate and still managed to lose money in a booming market, I said. If that is the legal counsel you are counting on, then you have already lost. I hung up the phone and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the board of directors wondering what had just happened. I did not look back. I had a flight to catch, and a new life to build, one where I was the only one in control of my wealth. My bank accounts were secure, my trusts were locked tight, and the person who had been bleeding me dry was finally out of my pockets for good. I felt a surge of pride, knowing that I had protected everything I had worked for, and that the man who had underestimated me for years would now have to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet for the first time in his adult life. I walked through the hotel lobby toward the exit, my mind already calculating the next steps in the acquisition. I had a lot of work to do and a life to reclaim. The divorce was just the beginning. I knew he would not go quietly, and I knew his family would try to intervene because they were just as greedy as he was, but I had prepared for that too. I had all the files stored in a safe place, and I was ready for a court battle if that was what he wanted. I just wanted my peace and my autonomy back, and I was finally on my way to having it. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, heading up to my room to pack. Tomorrow I would be heading home to a house that was legally and fully mine, and I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he realized that he had no home to go back to. I knew he would try to make a scene, but I was no longer the woman who feared his outbursts or his threats. I was the director of wealth management, and I knew exactly how to handle assets and liabilities. Jamal was now officially a liability I was writing off for good. I reached my room and locked the door behind me, finally allowing myself a moment to just sit in the silence. It was a beautiful room, but I wasn't here to relax. I was here to finish what I started. The acquisition was just the first part of my plan to secure my future. I pulled out my laptop and started reviewing the final documents one more time. I had everything under control, and for the first time I realized that my life had been too small for the ambition I had been hiding. I was ready to be big. I was ready to be powerful, and I was ready to leave the weight of Jamal and his family in the past where it belonged. I felt a strange sense of excitement for the future. The unknown was no longer scary, it was an opportunity for me to rewrite my story. I had the resources, I had the talent, and most importantly, I had the freedom to choose my own path. I was ready to take on whatever came next. I checked my messages one last time and saw that Keisha had joined the chat, now demanding to know why I had cut off her brother's funds. I did not respond. I simply blocked the entire family and turned off my phone completely. I needed sleep, and tomorrow would be the start of my new life. A life that I had fought for, and a life that I would protect with everything I had. I looked out the window at the city lights one more time, feeling a sense of satisfaction. I had done it. I had stood up for myself, and I had won. It was time for a new chapter, and I was excited for everything that was to come. I drifted off to sleep, dreaming of the success I would build, and the woman I would become. I knew the coming days would be full of conflict and challenges, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. I had worked hard to get here, and I had the strength to handle whatever came my way. I was ready to build a life that was truly my own, and I was ready for the future. It was going to be a long week, but I knew I had everything I needed to win. I was ready to face the world again. Everything was going to be different from this moment on, and I was finally ready to start. I was ready for whatever the future had in store for me, and I was ready to take it on. I finally felt a sense of clarity that I had not felt in years. Everything was going to be all right now. I was going to be okay. I was going to be strong. I was going to be the success I always knew I could be. I was finally free. It was all worth it. Everything I had been through had led me to this moment, and I was ready for it. I was ready to start my new life. I was finally ready to be the best version of myself. I was ready to begin. The future was mine to shape, and I was ready to start. I was finally ready. Everything felt right for the first time in years. I was ready to move forward, I was ready to thrive, I was ready to be happy, I was ready. The heavy mahogany doors of the London boardroom had barely clicked shut behind me when my phone began to vibrate intensely against my palm. The caller ID flashed Jamal. His custom ringtone, a generic hip-hop beat he produced during his brief aspiring musician phase 5 years ago, echoed slightly in the quiet corridor of the corporate office. I accepted the call without a single shred of hesitation. Before I could even take a breath, he let out a sharp, nervous bark of laughter that grated against my ears. He honestly thought I was playing some kind of twisted game with his lifestyle funding. He told me I had a cute sense of humor for a woman who was supposed to be working and making him money. He demanded to know if the wire transfer for his allowance was just delayed because of the international time difference. I listened to the sound of his breathing over the international line. He was pacing back and forth. I could hear the distinct acoustic echo of a large high-ceiling room in the background, mixed with the low murmur of salesmen and the sharp squeak of polished shoes on tile. When I remained completely silent, the nervous edge in his voice vanished entirely. It was quickly replaced by the familiar arrogant drawl he used whenever he felt cornered or questioned by a woman. He told me to stop acting crazy and send the $5,000 immediately before he actually got his lawyers involved. He said he had been talking to Trent. Trent is his sister Keisha's husband. Trent is a white commercial real estate agent who inherited his father's firm and walks around acting like he built the entire city with his bare hands. Trent had apparently spent Sunday dinner explaining community property laws to Jamal over expensive imported cigars that I had paid for with my end-of-year bonus. Jamal proudly recited Trent's exact words back to me like he was delivering a winning argument in a Supreme Court hearing. He boasted that we live in a 50-50 state and that my corporate bonuses, my investment portfolios, and my hard-earned retirement accounts belong to him just as much as they belong to me. Jamal threatened that if I actually wanted to play the divorce card, he would take half of my assets and secure permanent alimony for the rest of his life. He said Trent already gave him the name of a ruthless attorney who specializes in stripping high-earning wives of their wealth. He actually chuckled and told me I would be working until I was 80 years old just to fund his lifestyle whether we were married or not. I let him talk and reveal every terrible part of his character. I let him paint a vivid picture of his own profound entitlement. It was the exact same entitlement he showed 3 years ago when he quit his entry-level logistics job because the regional manager asked him to arrive on time. Back then, he claimed he was an entrepreneur who needed mental space to build his lifestyle brand. That brand consisted entirely of him playing golf on Tuesday mornings and buying vintage sneakers on Thursday afternoons while I worked 80-hour weeks. Trent had heavily encouraged him back then. Trent loved telling Jamal that behind every great visionary man is a woman footing the bill until his true genius is recognized by the world. I had swallowed my pride back then to keep the peace and to maintain the image of a supportive and loving wife to my family and peers. I paid off his luxury sports car so he could look successful. I funded his endless networking trips to Miami that yielded absolutely zero business revenue and only resulted in massive credit card bills. I sat silently at family barbecues and let Trent make snide, passive-aggressive comments about how I was just a corporate drone while Jamal was the real creative visionary of the family. Trent always looked at me with this underlying smirk, like my success as a black woman in high-level finance was just a lucky fluke, while his inherited mediocrity was a sign of superior intellect. Jamal absorbed that toxic energy and weaponized it against me whenever I asked him to contribute a single dollar to our household expenses. He was oblivious to the reality of the woman he had married. He saw my silence over the last few years as weakness. He saw my willingness to pay the bills as submission. He never realized that my silence was actually the sound of me calculating my exit strategy. My job as the Director of Wealth Management requires me to assess risk and eliminate terrible investments. Jamal was the worst investment in my portfolio, and it was time to liquidate. He finally stopped to take a breath and demanded an answer about his monthly allowance, telling me I had 5 minutes to wire the cash before he called his lawyer. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely stripped of any emotion. I told him he should have paid closer attention to the mail arriving at our house. I heard a slight pause on his end as the confusion began to set in and disrupt his arrogant momentum. I explained that 3 months ago, while he was on a 2-week luxury vacation in Cabo, that I completely funded, I filed the official divorce papers. Since he never bothered to check the mailbox at our primary residence and spent all his waking hours at his startup incubator space playing ping pong, he never saw the physical notices. When he failed to respond to the standard legal service, my attorneys immediately moved to serve him via publication. I explained the legal process to him slowly so he could understand exactly how badly he had messed up his own life through sheer laziness. We placed the legal notices in the local business journal for 4 consecutive weeks, fulfilling the legal requirement for serving a spouse who cannot be located. I told him it was a brilliant strategy because I knew he never read anything related to actual business or finance. He started shouting over the phone, calling me a liar, and claiming that was legally impossible in our state. He said Trent told him a wife could never just divorce her husband without a massive financial settlement and months of mediation. I cut him off smoothly and decisively. I told him the default judgment was finalized by the judge at exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. Because he failed to contest the filing or show up to a single court date, the judge granted my proposed division of assets in its entirety. I told him the court recognized my premarital assets and granted my requests based on his total lack of response and documented failure to contribute financially to the marriage. I made sure my words were perfectly clear so there could be no misunderstanding. He gets absolutely nothing from my accounts. I told him to have a great life and pressed the end call button before he could scream another word into my ear. I did not wait for his reaction or give him the satisfaction of hearing me breathe. I immediately opened my private banking app on my phone and logged in with my biometric scan. The secure screen loaded, showing our joint credit accounts, which were strictly funded by my corporate salary. I navigated to the real-time transaction ledger for the primary card he carried in his wallet. I could see a pending authorization request popping up on the screen right at that very second. It was a request for a $75,000 down payment at a luxury imported auto dealership. He was literally standing at the finance desk, trying to swipe my card for his new toy, while threatening to divorce me over the phone. I smiled, looking out the window at the London skyline, and tapped the security screen, permanently freezing every single card bearing his name and wiping his access to my wealth forever. The vibration in my hand felt like a pulse, a frantic, desperate rhythm that echoed the chaos I knew was currently erupting in Milwaukee. I didn't have to look at the screen to know it was Brenda. The caller ID glowed with her name, and I let it ring through twice, staring out at the gray, rain-slicked streets of London from my hotel window. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on, painting the damp pavement in streaks of neon gold. I finally swiped to answer, pressing the phone to my ear. I didn't offer a greeting, and I certainly didn't offer an apology. Brenda didn't waste time either. Her voice hit me like a physical force, shrill and laced with a venom I had grown far too accustomed to over the last 4 years. She screamed into the receiver, calling me a devil woman, a cold-hearted snake and a traitor. She wanted to know what I had done to her son, why he was currently standing in a bank lobby, looking like a fool with a credit card that refused to authorize his luxury car purchase. I kept my breathing steady, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching a black cab navigate the traffic below. I knew exactly what Jamal had told her. He had called her the moment I hung up, spinning a tale of an irrational, overworked wife who had lost her mind because of the stress of my corporate position. He had painted himself as the victim, the man who was being cut off simply because he stood up for himself. Brenda was the perfect audience for his lies because she had raised him to believe he was a king, regardless of the fact that he hadn't contributed a single dollar to our household in 48 months. She screamed about how I was ruining his dreams, how I was killing the only joy in his life, and how I would regret the day I ever thought I was powerful enough to walk away from a family that had taken me in when I was nobody. That was her favorite line. She loved to remind me that she and Jamal had rescued me from my own mediocrity, as if my success as a wealth management director was somehow a gift they had bestowed upon me. The backstory of her resentment wasn't complicated, just deeply ingrained. Brenda had spent Jamal's entire childhood telling him he was destined for greatness, even as he drifted from one failed hobby to the next. When we married, she viewed me not as an equal partner to her son, but as the engine that would finally pull his train into greatness. She felt entitled to my success, because she felt entitled to everything that touched her precious boy. For years, I had listened to her disparage my career, calling my work tedious and unglamorous, compared to the grand, vague concepts Jamal was always supposedly developing. She resented that I was successful on my own terms, that I didn't need Jamal to define me, and that I had the audacity to manage my own finances with a caution she found insulting. She shouted her words running together in a breathless tirade about how I was a cold, money-obsessed woman who never had any intention of being a real wife. She told me that Jamal had given up his youth and his potential to support my ambition, which was so far from reality that I almost felt a flicker of laughter in my chest. He hadn't given up anything except his bed linens until noon and a gym membership I paid for. She accused me of being a calculated monster who planned this divorce the second I realized I was making more money than him. Every word she uttered was a projection of her own insecurities and her own desperate need to maintain control over a narrative that I had already deleted. She told me that she was going to call my firm, that she was going to call my father, that she was going to make sure everyone knew I was an ungrateful wretch who couldn't keep a marriage together. I waited until she paused for breath, a brief moment of silence on her end that signaled she was waiting for a reaction for me to plead or try to justify my actions. I gave her neither. I spoke clearly, my voice devoid of the shaky hesitation she expected to hear. I told her to save her breath because her threats were as empty as Jamal's promises. I reminded her that while she was currently shouting at me from the comfort of her living room, she was doing so using a family phone plan that I was paying for with my own money. I informed her that the condo she lived in, which I had graciously paid for 2 years ago when she was facing foreclosure, was under my name, and the HOA fees that kept her lights on and her driveway plowed were coming directly from my corporate checking account. I told her that she was currently enjoying the very lifestyle I was allegedly too cold and calculating to provide for her son. The silence that greeted me was not one of realization or shame, but of absolute dumbfounded rage. She stuttered, struggling to find words that would bridge the gap between her self-righteousness and the reality of her financial dependence on me. She started in again, louder this time, swearing that she would find a way to pay me back every cent, that she would never touch my money again, and that I was a petty, small-minded woman who wouldn't be able to live with herself. I didn't let her finish. I didn't want to hear her justifications or her empty promises of repayment. I didn't want to engage in a back and forth about who owed what. I simply clicked the button on my banking dashboard that controlled the service for the family plan. I watched the status change to disconnected. I then opened the real estate management portal for the condo and scheduled the stop payment for the next month's HOA fees. As I disconnected the call, a profound sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't the relief of victory, not yet, but the relief of finally taking action. The emotional weight of the last 4 years, the silent resentment, the constant feeling of being undervalued and taken for granted began to lift. I looked at the phone screen, now dark, and felt only a cold, sharp clarity. Brenda was just the first in a line of people who would learn that my generosity had finally been replaced by reality. Jamal would be next. Trent would be next. The entire family of vultures who had built their comfortable nests on the branch of my success would find that I had finally decided to saw that branch right off the tree. I took a deep breath and walked away from the window. My flight back to the States was in less than 6 hours, and I had a life to prepare for. One that didn't include paying for the convenience of people who actively despised me. The silence in the room was absolute, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like space. It was the space I had been denying myself for so long, because I was too busy managing the egos and expenses of people who couldn't even manage their own lives. I walked to the bed and sat down, feeling the soft linens beneath my hands. The acquisition was finished, the divorce was finalized, the leeches were cut off. I had navigated the storm and was finally reaching the shore. My phone buzzed again, a flurry of texts from Keisha now. She was likely hearing the fallout from Jamal and Brenda in real time. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew the script by heart. It was a cycle of entitlement and abuse that I had finally decisively broken. I was 35, successful, wealthy, and for the first time in 4 years, completely unencumbered by the people who had tried to define my existence. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a moment of gratitude. Not for the tragedy, but for the clarity it had forced upon me. I had been a fool for love, but I would not be a fool for financial dependence anymore. I opened my eyes, grabbed my laptop, and started drafting the emails for the transition of my estate management. I was going home, and I was going home to an empty house that I would finally own. In truth, not just on paper. The victory felt as sharp as a diamond, and as cold as the truth I had finally spoken. I was ready for whatever was coming next. Whether they showed up at my doorstep, or tried to threaten me from afar, they would find that the woman who left had returned as a force they couldn't control. The game had changed, and I was the one holding all the cards now. I took one final look at the view of London, a city that had witnessed the end of my past life, and prepared to board the plane toward my actual future. I was finally free. Every penny, every hour, every ounce of energy I had spent on them was now redirected back to me. It was a lesson in self-respect, and it was a lesson I would never forget. I felt a surge of energy, a focus that I had only ever directed at my work now aimed at my own life. Everything was clear. Everything was settled. Everything was mine. The silence in my London hotel room lasted exactly 12 minutes before my phone screen illuminated the dim space once again. I was calmly folding my tailored blazer into my suitcase, anticipating a quiet evening before my flight back to the States. Instead, I was met with a massive block of text. It was a message so incredibly long that I had to scroll 3 separate times just to reach the end of it. The sender was Trent. Trent is my sister-in-law Keisha's husband. He is a white commercial real estate agent who operates under the heavy delusion that wearing an ill-fitting suit and speaking in an aggressively loud voice makes him an apex predator in the business world. Trent has always carried a very specific and toxic brand of arrogance, especially around me. He is the kind of mediocre man who feels deeply and physically threatened by a highly successful black woman. He has spent the entirety of my 4-year marriage to Jamal making passive-aggressive jokes at our family dinners. He would casually imply that my position as Director of Wealth Management was the result of diversity quotas, rather than my own grinding work ethic and superior intellect. Now Trent was attempting to play the role of a legal savior for his brother-in-law. His text message was a frantic and poorly constructed wall of pseudo-legal jargon. He threw around phrases like breach of fiduciary duty and marital asset seizure with the unearned confidence of a man who watches too many courtroom dramas on television. He haughtily explained that I cannot legally cut off a spouse from access to marital funds without a signed judge's order. He told me that Jamal was a legal financial dependent and that my sudden actions constituted severe financial abuse and emotional cruelty. Trent went on to explicitly threaten me. He claimed he was already on the phone with his top-tier legal connections, and they were actively preparing emergency injunctions to freeze my corporate accounts by morning. He stated that his lawyers would contact my firm's Human Resources Department in New York to report my erratic and vindictive behavior. Trent did not stop at fake legal threats. He decided to attack my character directly. He called me an arrogant corporate drone who lacked basic human empathy and warmth. He said I completely misunderstood the concept of family loyalty, and that I was tearing apart a loving household over petty financial grievances. He wrote that Jamal had sacrificed his own peace of mind and his youth to support my demanding career. According to Trent, my decision to pull the rug out from under Jamal proved I was exactly the kind of cold and selfish woman they all secretly suspected I was behind my back. Trent told me I needed to wire the $5,000 to Jamal immediately, plus an extra $2,000 to compensate for the emotional distress I had caused him today. If I failed to comply, Trent promised he would personally make sure I lost my job, my licenses, and my hard-earned reputation in the financial sector. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and read his long-winded message a second time. I did not feel a single shred of intimidation. I did not feel fear or anxiety. I felt profound pity for a man so incredibly out of his depth. Trent assumed I would panic. He assumed I would be intimidated by a loud man throwing legal terminology at me from across the ocean. He completely failed to realize that I am a woman who spends my days negotiating multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions with actual titans of industry. Trent was a struggling real estate agent who had not closed a significant commercial property deal in over 8 months. I knew this fact intimately because I make it my absolute business to know exactly where my money flows and who is swimming in my financial wake. I did not reply with a long defensive paragraph. I did not waste my breath arguing about community property laws or explaining the legal finality of the default judgment I had already quietly secured. Explaining yourself to an arrogant fool is a complete waste of valuable time. Instead, I opened the encrypted corporate drive on my laptop. I navigated to a specific subfolder I had created 3 weeks ago when I began conducting a thorough forensic audit of the joint checking account. Jamal believed he was so clever at hiding his daily activities within. Jamal had always been careless with his spending, but last month I noticed a highly unusual irregularity that caught my professional attention. It was not another ridiculous charge for designer clothes or luxury car rentals. It was a massive outbound wire transfer. Trent and Jamal had likely conspired over drinks, laughing about how easy it was to pull the wool over the eyes of the busy working wife. They probably patted themselves on the back for outsmarting the financial expert. Jamal wanted to play the role of the big-shot investor saving his brother-in-law's sinking ship, and Trent was arrogant enough to believe that taking money from a black woman without her knowledge was simply his right. They severely underestimated my vigilance. I monitor my liquidity with the exact same ruthless precision that I apply to my corporate clients. The moment the wire transfer hit the ledger, my automated alert systems flagged the anomaly. I had simply filed the evidence away, waiting for the exact right moment to deploy it for maximum destruction. Today was that moment. Trent had walked right into the trap I had patiently set. I pulled up the exact digital receipt from the bank archive and expanded the image on my high-resolution screen. I took a crisp screenshot of the transaction and cropped it perfectly, so the routing numbers, the originating account, and the destination details were blazingly clear. The image displayed a direct wire transfer of $40,000. The money had moved directly from my corporate salary deposit account into a secondary business holding account. The destination account belonged exclusively to Trent's commercial real estate brokerage. Jamal had secretly funneled $40,000 of my hard-earned money directly to Trent in a desperate bid to keep his failing brokerage from going completely bankrupt. Trent had taken my cash to cover his expensive office lease and pay his assistant because his own business was sinking rapidly into the ground. He had knowingly and willingly accepted misappropriated funds from a man who had zero independent income. They thought they were brilliant. They thought I was just a busy woman who would not notice $40,000 slipping out the back door. I attached the screenshot to the text thread with Trent. I kept my response surgical and precise. I typed out my reply, keeping my tone completely devoid of the emotion he was desperately trying to provoke. I told Trent that his long lecture on family loyalty was fascinating, considering he was currently financing his failing real estate business with my stolen money. I pointed out that accepting a $40,000 wire transfer from an unemployed man without the primary account holder's explicit consent is not a family favor or a simple loan. It is a federal crime. I informed Trent that I was not an arrogant corporate drone, but a highly trained financial executive who tracks every single penny attached to her name. I told him that I did not need to hire top-tier lawyers to freeze his meager accounts, because I had the power of the federal authorities to do that for me. I laid out the exact terms of his survival without an ounce of hesitation. I gave him exactly 24 hours to return the stolen $40,000 to my personal account. I told him if that exact sum of money was not sitting securely in my account by the time my flight landed in the United States tomorrow, I would hand this screenshot and his business routing information directly to the authorities. I would file a formal police report for embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. I hit send and watched the little delivered icon appear beneath the image on my screen. The effect on his end was immediate and deeply satisfying. The steady stream of incoming typing bubbles from Trent completely vanished. The aggressive legal threats, the arrogant insults, the condescending lectures about family loyalty, all of it evaporated into pure, absolute silence. He realized in a matter of seconds that he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear war. He had tried to intimidate the very woman who was unknowingly keeping his entire professional life from collapsing into ruin. I knew Trent was currently sitting in his office staring at his phone screen while his blood ran cold. He knew that a federal investigation into his brokerage would result in the immediate loss of his real estate license. He would lose his house, his car, and his fragile reputation in the local business community. He would be exposed as a fraud who had to steal from his sister-in-law just to keep the lights on. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that it probably gave him whiplash. I smiled as I zipped my suitcase closed. I had neutralized the mother-in-law, and I had neutralized the arrogant brother-in-law. The supporting cast of this pathetic drama was being systematically removed from the stage, leaving only Jamal. My phone remained blissfully silent as I turned off the lights in my hotel room. The foundation of their entitlement was crumbling, and I had not even crossed the Atlantic Ocean yet. I was bringing a storm back to the States, and Trent was the first one to realize there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The satisfaction of shutting down Trent was a potent high, but I did not allow myself to linger on the victory for much too long. I slipped my laptop into my travel bag, checked my passport, and walked out of the hotel room without a single backward glance. The ride to London Airport was incredibly smooth, the gray rain washing the tinted windows of my private car as I mentally reviewed my travel itinerary. I easily bypassed the crowded terminals, moving swiftly through the priority security lanes and settling into the quiet sanctuary of the premium lounge. My phone had remained peacefully dormant since I delivered my ultimatum to Trent. I knew he was currently scrambling, desperately trying to liquidate assets, or beg his wealthy friends to cover the stolen $40,000 before my deadline expired. He was entirely trapped. But Jamal would not remain silent for very long. My flight was called, and I boarded the aircraft, taking my assigned seat in the spacious private pod. The flight attendant immediately offered me a glass of vintage champagne, which I gladly and thankfully accepted with a polite, silent nod of gratitude. I was just about to switch my phone to airplane mode when a notification violently vibrated against my open, waiting palm. It was an audio message from Jamal. The digital file was exactly 3 full minutes long. I took a slow sip of my champagne, placed the crystal flute on the side table, and connected my wireless earbuds. I pressed play, entirely prepared, and calmly waiting for whatever pathetic display of masculine fragility he was about to unleash upon me. I was instantly hit with a solid wall of chaotic and overwhelming noise. Jamal was not in the quiet comfort of our suburban home or his overpriced incubator. He was standing in the very middle of a public, very echoey bank lobby. I could clearly hear the frantic shuffling of papers, the low murmurs of uncomfortable customers, and the sharp, authoritative voice of a bank manager attempting to de-escalate a highly volatile situation. Over all of this background noise, Jamal was screaming. His voice cracked with a hysterical, intense panic that completely stripped away every ounce of his usual fake, arrogant drawl. He was throwing a severe toddler tantrum in the middle of a prestigious financial institution. The echo of his voice bounced off the marble walls, broadcasting his entire meltdown to a live audience of strangers who were simply trying to deposit their weekly paychecks. He shouted directly into the microphone, his breathing incredibly heavy and completely erratic. He demanded to know what kind of sick illegal game I was playing with his extremely important life. He screamed that the bank teller had just handed him a printed statement showing our primary joint savings account possessed a grand total of $1,500. He was hyperventilating, repeating that specific number over and over again, as if saying it louder would magically add a few zeros to the very end. $1,500. That was the entirety of the financial safety net he thought he possessed. It was all that remained to fund his expensive lifestyle. His utter confusion rapidly morphed into a terrifying realization that the free ride he had enjoyed for years was abruptly terminating today, leaving him completely exposed and utterly defenseless against the harsh, unforgiving reality of the actual world. I listened as he slammed his fist against what sounded like the thick, reinforced teller window glass. He furiously accused me of committing grand larceny against my own lawful husband. He loudly proclaimed to the entire bewildered bank staff that I was a criminal mastermind who had illegally siphoned our shared wealth into hidden offshore accounts. He yelled that he knew I was secretly funneling marital assets to the Cayman Islands or Switzerland because there was absolutely no way a woman in my high professional position only had $1,500 in liquid savings. He was utterly convinced that I had committed massive financial fraud to intentionally hide his rightful half of our combined money. He ranted about international wire transfers and shell corporations using terminology he had clearly learned from watching daytime television, completely oblivious to how insane he sounded to the finance professionals who were watching his public meltdown. His threats rapidly escalated from a messy divorce to immediate criminal prosecution. He promised he was calling the local police and the Internal Revenue Service the absolute very second he left the bank building. He swore he would have me arrested in handcuffs the exact moment I stepped off the plane on the cold American soil. He told me I would be spending the rest of my miserable life in a federal penitentiary for severe financial crimes against my spouse. In the background of his recording, I heard a security guard politely but firmly ask him to lower his voice or step outside the premises immediately. Jamal completely ignored the guard, shouting one final desperate threat into the phone before the audio clipped and ended abruptly. The sudden silence in my earbuds was golden, a beautiful contrast to the unhinged venom he had just spewed into the digital void. I sat back in my luxurious leather seat, the quiet, gentle hum of the airplane engines providing a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just listened to, felt a profound sense of secondhand embarrassment for the man I had married. He was an adult throwing a highly public fit over a bank balance he had never once financially contributed to. He genuinely believed that my corporate salary, my performance bonuses, and my market investments were simply sitting in a standard basic joint checking account, passively waiting for him to withdraw whatever cash he pleased. His overall financial illiteracy was truly deeply staggering to witness. He had spent 4 long years married to a wealth management director and had never bothered to learn a single basic concept about how wealth was actually structured, legally protected, and actively grown for the future. His sheer ignorance was his ultimate downfall. I did not panic at his ridiculous threats of federal investigations. In fact, I warmly welcomed them. Any competent forensic accountant would take one single look at my ledgers and literally laugh Jamal out of the room. I calmly opened my recording application. I was not going to send a frantic text message or type out a long defensive paragraph. I was going to match his chaotic energy with absolute freezing precision. I pressed the red digital record button and spoke in a low, perfectly controlled tone that conveyed zero emotion. I started by advising him to stop screaming at bank tellers who merely make minimum wage before he genuinely got himself arrested for creating a public disturbance. I kept my voice incredibly smooth and conversational, acting exactly like I was explaining a very simple arithmetic concept to a very slow, highly emotional, and completely unreasonable spoiled child in trouble. I directly addressed his absolutely wild accusation regarding hidden offshore accounts. I told him he clearly watched far too many bad television movies if he truly thought high-level executives hid their money in Caribbean tax havens. I explained that I did not need to do anything remotely illegal to protect my money from a lazy man who spent his days buying vintage sneakers and playing table ping pong with other unemployed men. I then addressed the specific bank account he was currently weeping over in public. I calmly explained the harsh reality of his financial existence for the past 4 years. I told him that the $5,000 that magically and consistently appeared in that specific joint account every single month was never a true reflection of our total wealth. I told him it was absolutely not his rightful share of my success. It was simply a carefully calculated monthly allowance. I explained that the $5,000 was essentially a shiny toy I handed him to keep his incredibly simple mind occupied. It was nothing more than a convenient distraction. It was the necessary cost of doing business to fund his endless golf rounds and his totally useless networking trips solely to buy myself the peace I desperately needed to build my empire. I then delivered the final fatal blow. I deliberately lowered my voice, revealing that while he slept until noon, my actual career yielded a staggering 7-figure annual income. I explained that this massive income did not go into a joint account. For the entirety of our marriage, every substantial bonus and salary increase had been entirely legally funneled directly into a blind trust he had absolutely zero access to. The $1,500 he was staring at was his entire remaining net worth. I finished by cheerfully wishing him luck with his pending luxury car purchase and strongly suggesting he buy a bus pass instead. I hit send, switched off, and flew away. The heavy thrust of the airplane engines shifted into a steady cruising hum as we leveled out above the gray clouds. I reclined my seat and connected my laptop to the complimentary premium wireless internet. I had barely opened my inbox when my phone illuminated with a fresh notification. Jamal had not taken the revelation of the blind trust with any shred of quiet dignity. Instead, he sent a frantic string of text messages attempting to project an aura of legal superiority. He claimed that blind trusts created during a marriage were entirely void in our state. He proudly declared that Trent had just assured him family court judges routinely tear apart those kinds of hidden financial structures. He typed with a renewed, arrogant vigor, stating that Trent had elite attorneys on speed dial who specialized in reversing fraudulent asset concealment. Jamal promised that he would not only take half of the trust, but he would also ensure the judge penalized me for attempting to hide marital property. He genuinely thought he had caught me in a legal trap. He thought Trent was providing him with bulletproof legal counsel. His confidence was completely misplaced and entirely built on a foundation of profound ignorance. I did not feel a single pulse of anxiety reading his empty threats. I simply opened another encrypted folder on my hard drive and smiled. Jamal had completely forgotten the events that took place exactly 2 years ago. Back then, Jamal had discovered a brand new obsession. One of his equally unemployed friends from the local golf club had pitched him on a revolutionary cryptocurrency venture. It was a guaranteed disaster, a digital pyramid scheme wrapped in tech buzzwords that neither of them actually understood. But Jamal was completely captivated. He spent 3 solid weeks begging me for $100,000 to buy into the ground floor of this so-called revolutionary opportunity. He promised me it would make him a rich millionaire within 6 months. He swore it was the only investment he would ever need, and that he would finally be able to contribute to our lifestyle. He threw tantrums, he sulked, and he loudly accused me of holding him back from his true financial destiny by keeping my wealth locked away from his visionary ideas. I knew the crypto venture was going to crash and burn spectacularly. I knew the money would vanish the exact second the wire transfer cleared. But I also saw the perfect golden opportunity to permanently secure my financial future against a man I knew was nothing more than a liability. I agreed to give him the $100,000. I told him I believed in his vision, but I insisted that because it was such a significant amount of capital, we needed to treat it as a formal business transaction. Jamal was so blinded by his greed and his desperation to get his hands on the cash that he enthusiastically agreed to whatever parameters I suggested. I had my personal legal team draft a highly complex, incredibly dense stack of financial documents. On the surface, the paperwork looked like a standard business loan and investment agreement between spouses. But my lawyers were ruthless, brilliant professionals who understood exactly what I needed to achieve. I arranged a meeting at my legal office downtown. Jamal arrived wearing a designer suit I had paid for acting like a heavy-hitting investor, ready to close a massive corporate merger. My lead attorney placed a stack of documents on the mahogany table that was easily 60 pages thick. He politely informed Jamal that he had every right to retain independent counsel to review the paperwork before signing. Jamal scoffed at the suggestion. He was in a rush. He wanted the funds released before the weekend so he could celebrate his new venture in Miami. He grabbed the expensive pen from the table and began flipping through the pages with reckless, eager speed, signing and initialing exactly where the bright yellow sticky notes directed him. He never read a single paragraph. If he had bothered to slow down and actually read the legally binding text he was putting his name on, he would have discovered the absolute masterpiece of a trap buried deep within the legal jargon. Right there on page 42, seamlessly woven into the investment clauses, was an ironclad, legally binding post-marital agreement. In exchange for the immediate unencumbered release of the $100,000 lump sum, Jamal permanently and irrevocably waived all present and future rights to my corporate earnings, my investment portfolios, and any trusts established in my name. The document explicitly stated that he relinquished any claim to alimony, spousal support, or asset division in the event of a divorce. He traded his legal rights to my entire financial empire for a single foolish gamble that he subsequently lost in less than 90 days. The cryptocurrency venture collapsed exactly as I predicted, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a worthless digital wallet and wounded pride. I had absorbed the financial loss easily, considering it the absolute best investment I had ever made in my entire life. I bought my permanent freedom for $100,000, and Jamal had eagerly signed the receipt. I dragged the digitized copy of the fully executed document from my secure folder and attached it directly to our text message thread. I highlighted the specific paragraphs on page 42 using a bright red digital marker. I sent the file to Jamal with a very brief, incredibly clear explanation. I told him that Trent and his high-level lawyers could try to tear apart the blind trust all they wanted. It would not matter in the slightest because he had legally signed away his right to touch my money 2 years ago. I reminded him that he traded his marital rights for a crypto scam that vanished into thin air. I advised him to show the document to whatever discount lawyer Trent managed to find for him and watch the color drain completely out of the face of that lawyer. The legal trap was sprung, the jaws locked tightly around his ankles, and there was no judicial mechanism in the state that could pry him loose. I watched the read receipt appear beneath the PDF file. I knew Jamal was frantically zooming in on his own signature, staring at the death warrant of his luxurious lifestyle. I imagined the panic setting in, the cold sweat forming on his brow as his complete lack of attention to detail finally destroyed him. Before he could even formulate a response, my phone vibrated with a different notification. It was not a private message from Jamal. The notification popped up from the main family group chat. The chat had been dormant for weeks, but was suddenly resurrected by Keisha. Keisha is the wife of Trent and older sister to Jamal. She shares the exact same brand of toxic entitlement that infects her brother and her mother. She has always deeply resented my corporate success, viewing my wealth as a personal insult to her own mundane existence. She typed a long, aggressive paragraph into the group chat tagging me directly, so I would be forced to see her vitriol. Keisha mocked me with a barrage of laughing emojis. She called me a sad, lonely woman who thought money could buy superiority. She announced to the entire family group chat that I was delusional if I thought Jamal was going to walk away empty-handed. She proudly proclaimed that they did not need a single dime of my hoarded corporate cash anyway. Keisha boasted with supreme confidence that her husband Trent was currently in the final stages of closing a massive, unprecedented commercial real estate deal. She claimed this specific transaction was going to shatter local records and make them millions of dollars in pure commission before the end of the month. She gleefully typed that the newfound millions of Trent would allow them to personally fund the entire legal war against me. She promised they would hire a fleet of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the country to bleed me completely dry, just for the pure satisfaction of watching me fall from my corporate pedestal. Keisha told me to prepare myself for absolute ruin because her husband was about to become the wealthiest man in our entire circle. I read her completely detached and incredibly arrogant messages with a mixture of absolute fascination and profound amusement. Keisha was proudly broadcasting her husband and his magnificent fictional success to a group chat, while I sat alone holding the exact digital proof of his desperate, miserable reality. She genuinely believed that Trent was a commercial real estate titan, on the verge of securing a $2 million commission. She had absolutely no idea that her genius husband was actually drowning in massive corporate debt and failing miserably. The cold truth would absolutely destroy them all tonight. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as Keisha's messages continued to flood the family group chat. She was typing with a frantic, unearned arrogance, detailing the lavish lifestyle she and Trent were supposedly about to embark upon. She boasted about millions of dollars in impending commissions, private jets, and a fleet of ruthless attorneys who would supposedly tear my life apart. The sheer delusion of her tirade was almost magnificent to witness. She genuinely believed her husband was a master of the universe, a commercial real estate titan who was untouchable. I did not type a single character in response. I did not engage with her petty taunts or attempt to defend my position. Engaging with people who construct their entire reality out of fictional bravado is a complete waste of highly valuable time. I simply swiped the application closed, muted the conversation entirely, and placed the phone face down on the polished surface of my hotel desk. The silence in my suite was absolute, a perfect contrast to the digital hysteria erupting across the Atlantic Ocean. I turned my undivided attention back to the primary display of my laptop. The real reason I had flown to London was sitting in a secure, encrypted folder waiting for my final authorization. My personal drama with Jamal and his parasitic family was merely a microscopic distraction compared to the massive corporate maneuver I was actively executing. For the past 8 months, my firm had been quietly negotiating the hostile takeover of a massive international commercial real estate conglomerate. This specific conglomerate owned and managed billions of dollars in premium commercial properties across North America and Europe. They were a bloated, poorly managed giant, ripe for a ruthless restructuring, and I was the primary architect of the entire acquisition. My firm had positioned me as the lead director of the transition board, granting me absolute unilateral authority over the conglomerate's operational future. My mandate was simple. I was to trim the fat, eliminate redundant vendor contracts, and maximize profitability by any means necessary. I opened the final master file containing the conglomerate's operational budget and external vendor agreements. As the lead director, every single external contract was now subject to my direct review and approval. I began scrolling through the dense lists of property management firms, legal retainers, and regional brokerages that the conglomerate currently employed. The rain continued to beat a steady rhythm against my hotel window as I cross-referenced the North American regional data. I filtered the spreadsheet by the specific state where Trent and Jamal lived. I clicked into the detailed breakdown of regional brokerage partners. As the high-resolution screen populated with names and corporate entities, a deep, resonant hum of absolute satisfaction vibrated through my chest. The name of the brokerage flashed across the screen in stark, undeniable black and white text. It was Trent's firm. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took a slow, deep breath, allowing the sheer magnitude of the situation to wash over me. I opened a secondary window and pulled up the specific contractual history between the conglomerate and Trent's highly exaggerated brokerage firm. The data was illuminating and utterly pathetic. Trent did not just do business with this conglomerate, he was entirely, desperately dependent upon them. According to the internal financial metrics, a staggering 90% of Trent's annual revenue was generated by an exclusivity contract he held with this exact company. He managed their mid-level commercial leases in our home state, acting as a glorified middleman who skimmed a generous commission off the top of their corporate real estate portfolio. The pieces of the puzzle violently slammed into place with perfect crystalline clarity. The massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal Keisha was currently bragging about in the family group chat was not some independent entrepreneurial triumph. Trent was not hunting down new groundbreaking business. He was simply waiting for the annual renewal of his exclusivity contract with the conglomerate. He was banking his entire future, his lifestyle, and his arrogant swagger on a single corporate renewal. He believed the deal was a guaranteed certainty. He had already spent the anticipated commission in his mind, promising his wife millions of dollars and a fleet of ruthless divorce attorneys to use against me. He was standing on a towering pedestal of absolute arrogance, completely unaware that I was the one holding the sledgehammer right at the base of his fragile foundation. I was no longer just his successful sister-in-law, whom he openly despised. I was now the lead director of the board that controlled his entire professional livelihood. I owned the conglomerate that fed him. I controlled the budget that paid his lease. I held the absolute authority to approve or deny the very contract he was currently celebrating. The profound irony of the universe was almost too sweet to bear. Trent had spent years looking down on me, making snide remarks about diversity quotas, and secretly stealing $40,000 of my money to prop up his failing business. He had encouraged my husband to betray me and threatened to freeze my assets. Now, through pure, unrelenting professional competence, I had unknowingly maneuvered myself into a position of absolute power over his entire existence. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw a public tantrum like Jamal. I did not feel the need to boast in a group chat like Keisha. True power does not require an audience or a loud voice. True power is quiet, surgical, and absolutely devastating. I cracked my knuckles and opened a blank official corporate document template bearing the newly acquired conglomerate's letterhead. I began to type. I utilized the cold, precise language of high-level corporate restructuring. I did not use personal pronouns. I did not mention family ties or stolen money. I framed the document entirely around operational efficiency and fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. I drafted a formal notice of immediate termination for cause. I clearly cited the specific clauses within his existing exclusivity contract that allowed the parent company to sever ties in the event of major corporate restructuring. I detailed the immediate revocation of his brokerage's access to all conglomerate properties, secure databases, and pending lease agreements. I legally nullified the massive renewal contract he was currently celebrating. I stripped him of his primary revenue stream, with a few keystrokes transforming his thriving business into a hollow, bankrupt shell. The document was a masterpiece of corporate execution. It left no room for appeal, no margin for negotiation, and absolutely no legal loophole for his supposed top-tier attorneys to exploit. I read through the termination notice 3 times, ensuring every single comma and legal citation was absolutely flawless. The language was sterile and indifferent, which made it infinitely more punishing. Trent would receive this document and realize his entire world had collapsed, not because of a passionate family feud, but because he was simply deemed an inefficient, expendable line item by a faceless corporate board. He would have to explain to Keisha that the millions of dollars they were banking on had vanished into thin air. He would have to explain to his employees that they were officially out of a job. He would have to face the terrifying reality that his arrogant facade was gone, leaving only a desperate man drowning in debt and facing federal embezzlement charges. I attached the termination notice to a new email. I addressed it directly to Trent's professional inbox, copying his regional manager and the conglomerate's internal legal compliance team. I filled in the subject line with a mundane, terrifyingly vague corporate phrase regarding contract status and vendor restructuring. I moved my cursor over the send button, feeling the heavy weight of the moment. One click would decimate his life. One click would turn Keisha's arrogant boasting to absolute ash. But I paused. I looked at the digital clock on my computer screen. It was still the middle of the night back in the United States. Sending the email now would trigger automated alerts and wake him up in a panic. That was not the strategy I wanted to employ. I wanted him to wake up feeling victorious. I wanted him to walk into his office, pour himself a cup of expensive coffee, and sit behind his desk, believing he was the king of his small, pathetic world. I wanted him to feel the highest possible peak of arrogant confidence before I sent him plummeting into the abyss. I moved my cursor away from the send button and clicked the save to outbox option instead. The drafted email vanished from my main screen, safely stored and fully loaded in my outgoing queue, waiting for my final command. I closed my heavy laptop, completely confident and remarkably secure. The termination notice sat quietly in the dark, waiting for Trent to make his very next foolish move, sealing his own absolute and inevitable doom. The digital clock on my laptop flipped to 6. Before I could even reach for my espresso, my phone shattered the quiet elegance of the suite. The caller identification displayed Trent's name in stark white lettering. I had expected Jamal to call back first, crying or begging, but it seemed the brother-in-law had decided to step in and play the heroic savior. I had always despised Trent's endless posturing and his pathetic need to dominate conversations, but today his predictability was actually working perfectly in my favor. I let it ring 3 times before accepting the connection. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply raised the device to my ear and allowed the dead silence to force him into speaking first. Trent did not disappoint. His voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with the kind of condescending arrogance that only a mediocre man could muster. He sounded exactly like he did at every Thanksgiving dinner, loud, intrusive, and completely desperate to command a room that did not respect him. He launched directly into a poorly rehearsed monologue. He told me I had officially lost my mind, and that my stunt with the bank account was the most pathetic display of financial abuse he had ever witnessed. He spoke with the slow, exaggerated cadence of someone explaining a simple concept to a toddler. Trent haughtily informed me that he had personally taken charge of the situation because Jamal was too emotionally devastated to handle the legal logistics. He claimed he was stepping up to protect his family from an arrogant corporate predator who thought she could discard people. His absolute lack of self-awareness was staggering. He was actively scolding me for financial abuse while hiding $40,000 of my stolen money in his failing brokerage account to keep his lights on. I remained perfectly silent, allowing him to dig his own grave. My silence only fueled his misplaced confidence. He interpreted my lack of response as fear, assuming his aggressive posturing was successfully intimidating me. Trent escalated his demands, outlining my surrender. He stated that I was going to call my bank immediately and unfreeze the joint accounts. He demanded that I unconditionally transfer the deed of our primary residence directly into the sole name of Jamal before the end of the business week. He insisted I needed to quietly agree to a generous spousal support settlement out of court, essentially funding Jamal's lavish lifestyle indefinitely. Trent declared that if I simply followed his instructions and walked away, he would convince Jamal not to press criminal charges. He genuinely thought he held all the winning cards in this negotiation. When I did not immediately capitulate to his ransom demands, Trent deployed what he clearly believed was his ultimate weapon. He told me that I clearly did not understand the kind of powerful, influential people he did business with on a daily basis. He boasted that he was currently in the final stages of closing an unprecedented deal with million-dollar partners who possessed extensive connections across the global financial sector. He promised that these corporate allies would gladly use their massive influence to completely destroy my professional reputation if I refused to cooperate. Trent swore he would personally ensure I was blacklisted from every major wealth management firm, effectively ending my high-level career permanently. He threatened to make me completely unemployable, reducing me to the financially dependent state he had kept Jamal in. I listened to his frantic threats while my eyes remained locked on my computer monitor. The outbox folder was open, the termination notice sitting there like a loaded weapon, waiting for a single trigger pull. I recalled the countless family dinners where Trent had loudly mocked my career, joking that women in finance were just glorified secretaries. I remembered the smug smirk on his face when he accepted my stolen money to fund his fake lifestyle. He had spent years underestimating my intelligence, my ruthlessness, and my absolute control over my environment. I took a slow sip of my dark espresso, letting the bitter flavor ground me in the present moment. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming sense of clinical surgical precision. I was not a victim caught in a family dispute. I was an apex predator finalizing a corporate restructuring, and Trent was nothing more than an inefficient vendor contract that needed to be liquidated. I moved my right hand to the wireless mouse, my index finger resting lightly on the left button. Trent was running out of breath, his monologue reaching its frantic crescendo. He told me I had exactly 5 seconds to agree to his terms before he made the phone calls that would end my life. He actually started counting down from 5, his voice echoing in the quiet elegance of my London suite. I let him reach the number 2 before I finally spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. I did not address his threats or his demands for the house. I simply told him that I found his lecture on professional influence incredibly fascinating, considering he was a mediocre middleman who survived entirely on the unearned charity of a single corporate conglomerate. I told him he was standing on a paper-thin floor of lies, and I was the one holding the match. Before he could even process the meaning of my words, I pressed my index finger down on the mouse. The click was soft, but the impact was absolute. The email vanished from the outbox, launching directly into the digital void. I informed Trent that his 5 seconds were officially up, but it was not my career ending today. I told him to check his corporate inbox. A heavy, confused silence fell over the phone line. I could hear his shallow breathing as he processed my sudden shift in tone. He stammered, asking what exactly I was talking about, his arrogant facade cracking under the weight of my absolute certainty. I did not answer him. I simply waited, listening intently to the background noise filtering through his phone microphone. I heard the unmistakable, sharp digital chime of an incoming high-priority email echoing from his desktop computer speakers. I heard the squeak of his office chair as he leaned forward to read the notification. I heard the sudden, sharp intake of breath as his eyes scanned the sender identification. It was the official legal compliance department of the exact corporate conglomerate he relied on for 90% of his annual revenue. The conglomerate I now personally controlled. The trap had officially slammed shut, breaking his entire foundation into a million irreparable pieces. The sequence of events that followed was rapid, chaotic, and utterly glorious to experience. I heard Trent click open the attached termination notice. I heard him gasp a strangled sound of pure terror as he read the sterile, unforgiving legal language revoking his exclusivity contract and terminating his brokerage services, effectively, immediately. He tried to speak to ask me what kind of sick joke this was, but his voice completely failed him. The realization that I was the faceless corporate entity destroying his life hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. But the true masterpiece of this moment was not just his personal realization. It was the immediate collateral damage occurring in real time outside his office door. Over the phone line, I heard the heavy wooden door of his personal office suddenly slam open, the sound echoing loudly through the receiver. His lead assistant, a woman whose salary he could no longer afford to pay, burst into the room. Her voice was shrill, completely panicked, and loud enough for me to hear every single devastating syllable with crystal clarity. She screamed that the conglomerate had just locked them out of the entire database. I listened with rapt attention as the chaos continued to unfold loudly over the open cellular connection. His assistant frantically reported that all active property access codes had been simultaneously revoked, and their regional manager was currently calling to demand the immediate return of all corporate assets. She yelled that their biggest and most vital client had just terminated every single active contract without any prior warning, effectively bankrupting their entire brokerage firm in a matter of seconds. I heard Trent drop his phone onto his desk, the hard plastic clattering against the wood as he desperately tried to respond to his hysterical employee. He was completely ruined, his business destroyed, and his arrogant pride utterly decimated by the very woman he had spent years attempting to humiliate. I did not offer any final parting words or gloating remarks. I simply ended the call, severing the connection, and plunging my suite back into peaceful, luxurious silence. Keisha had proudly promised me $1 million legal war, but Trent no longer had the funds to even keep his office lights switched brightly on. The digital silence from Trent was a truly beautiful symphony, but I knew the peace would be short-lived. My phone illuminated the dim airport lounge 20 minutes after I dispatched the termination notice. The notification was not an apology. It was a rapid, aggressive succession of unhinged text messages from Jamal. He had just spoken to his older sister. Keisha must have called him in hysterical panic after watching her husband's real estate firm combust and fail in real time. The promised millions evaporated, their legal war chest was empty, and the grim reality of their ruin shattered their delusions of grandeur. Jamal was no longer coasting on the false confidence of his brother-in-law. He was cornered, terrified, and lashing out with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. I opened the thread and read his words with detached fascination. Jamal had abandoned his ridiculous threats of federal tax investigations and offshore seizures. The post-nuptial agreement had neutralized his offensive strategy regarding my corporate income and the blind trust. Instead, he made a desperate pivot to the only remaining asset he believed he possessed any legal claim over. He typed with aggressive entitlement, demanding that I surrender our primary residence. He angrily texted that I could keep my massive corporate trust fund and my miserable banking career because he did not want my tainted money anyway. But the house, he insisted, was entirely different. He loudly declared that the suburban estate was legally half his property. He reminded me that his name was physically printed on the original deed we signed 4 years ago. He was clinging to that single piece of paper like a desperate man clinging to a life raft. His demands escalated from simple ownership claims to deliberate malicious cruelty. Jamal proudly announced he was taking absolute control of the property effective immediately. He texted that since Trent suddenly lost his job, Keisha was inconsolable and needed a secure place to stay while they figured out their chaotic financial situation. He informed me he was officially moving his sister into our empty guest bedroom tonight. He wanted to inflict maximum emotional damage. He typed that he was also moving Brenda, his secret mistress, from the pharmaceutical office into our master suite. He justified this disgusting decision by claiming Brenda actually respected him and understood his true value. He finished his rant by ordering me to book a downtown hotel when my flight landed. He told me I was locked out of my own home and any attempt to enter the property would result in him calling the police to report me for domestic trespassing. I sat in the plush leather chair of the premium departure lounge and read his message 3 separate times. The audacity required to move a mistress and a toxic sister into a luxury house entirely funded by my corporate salary was almost impressive. Jamal genuinely believed he had backed me into a legal corner. He assumed I would react with explosive, overwhelming emotional rage. He expected me to call him sobbing, begging him not to bring another woman into our marital bed. He wanted a dramatic screaming fight to validate his wounded masculine pride. He wanted me to feel the exact same suffocating lack of control that he was currently experiencing. I refused to give him a single ounce of that satisfaction. I did not write a long defensive paragraph explaining the intricate nuances of local property law. I did not threaten him or demand that he keep his horrible family out of my house. I simply opened the emoji keyboard on my phone, selected the standard yellow thumbs up icon, and pressed send. A single universally understood symbol of cheerful, unbothered acknowledgement. It was the absolute most dismissive, infuriating response I could possibly deliver. I knew that tiny digital graphic would drive him absolutely insane. He wanted a war, and I gave him a pleasant, effortless dismissal. I locked the screen of my phone, slid the device into my tailored leather travel bag, and calmly gathered my belongings as the boarding announcement for my flight echoed softly through the pristine airport lounge. I walked down the jet bridge with my head held high, my posture perfectly straight, and my mind entirely focused on the impending destruction I was about to unleash. I stepped onto the aircraft and was immediately escorted to my assigned seat in the exclusive enclosed first-class cabin. The flight attendant offered to hang my blazer and poured me a glass of sparkling water with a slice of fresh lemon. I settled into the wide, deeply cushioned seat, relishing the quiet isolation of the private pod. As the heavy commercial jet taxied down the long runway and ascended into the dark, cloudy London sky, I allowed myself to relax and fully process the absolute stupidity of Jamal's latest desperate threat. He was banking his entire future on a fundamental misunderstanding of our property ownership. He remembered sitting in the bright, sunny office of our real estate attorney 4 years ago. He remembered signing a massive stack of closing documents and seeing his name printed next to mine on the official property deed. He assumed that singular moment cemented his legal right to the estate forever. What Jamal failed to comprehend was that the real estate closing was simply the beginning of my financial strategy, not the end. I had never trusted his careless spending habits, and I never intended to leave my most valuable physical asset vulnerable to his inevitable mistakes. The house had indeed been purchased in both our names initially to satisfy the mortgage lender requirements, but that specific arrangement had been temporary. My mind drifted back to the infamous, incredibly dense post-nuptial agreement he had so eagerly signed 2 years ago. The very same document that had just stripped him of my corporate trust fund contained multiple layers of hidden ironclad protection. The agreement was a masterpiece of legal engineering designed to completely insulate my wealth from his parasitic grasp. I opened the briefcase sitting next to my feet and extracted a thick, heavy legal folder. I placed it on the tray table, running my hand over the smooth, embossed cover. This folder contained the undeniable truth of my permanent victory. Inside rested the full, unredacted copy of the post-nuptial contract. But more importantly, tucked safely in the back pocket of the folder, was a separate, highly specific legal document that Jamal had signed on that exact same day. When he blindly scribbled his signature across page 42 to secure his $100,000 cryptocurrency loan, he had also executed a formal quitclaim deed. It was a standard legal mechanism that officially and irrevocably transferred his entire ownership interest in the suburban property directly to a private holding company. Jamal had absolutely no idea that he had legally surrendered his half of the house the moment the ink dried on that paper. He did not own the walls, and he certainly did not own the master bedroom he was moving his mistress into. The holding company was a discrete corporate entity that I solely owned and operated. I had filed the executed quitclaim deed with the county clerk the next morning, stripping his name from the records without him noticing. For 2 entire years, Jamal had been living in a house he had absolutely zero legal claim to. He was not a homeowner. In the eyes of the law, he was nothing more than an unauthorized tenant living on borrowed time. The flight across the Atlantic passed in a blur of focused anticipation. I did not sleep. I reviewed my documents, finalized my strategy, and mentally rehearsed the exact sequence of events that would occur upon my arrival. I was not just going to kick him out. I was going to execute a flawless, undeniable eviction that would leave him completely devastated and entirely homeless. The wheels finally hit the tarmac, signaling my return to American soil. I moved smoothly through the expedited customs line, the legal folder tucked securely under my arm. The evening air washed over me as I exited the terminal and approached the pickup zone. My private driver was waiting beside a sleek black luxury vehicle. He quickly opened the rear door, offering a polite nod of recognition. He asked if I wanted to head directly to my usual downtown hotel. I paused, looking at the dark, cloudy sky overhead. Jamal was currently sitting in my house surrounded by his toxic sister and his pathetic mistress, believing he had finally won the ultimate war. He was patiently waiting for me to surrender. I slid into the comfortable back seat, placing the heavy legal folder squarely on my lap. I looked directly at the driver through the dark rearview mirror and calmly gave him a single unwavering command. I told him to cancel the hotel reservation entirely and drive me straight to the suburban estate. The heavy oak front door of my suburban estate yielded to my key with a familiar metallic click. I stepped over the threshold, immediately hit by the chaotic thrum of loud bass and raucous laughter echoing through the vaulted foyer. The dramatic recessed lighting cast long theatrical shadows across the imported hardwood floors, illuminating a scene of absolute unapologetic invasion. The air smelled of cheap takeout and my exclusive vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. I closed the door behind me with a soft thud, pausing in the entryway to absorb the sheer magnificent audacity of the spectacle unfolding within my own home. I walked slowly toward the sunken living room, my heels completely silent on the thick Persian runner. The space had been entirely commandeered. Keisha was draped across my custom Italian leather sofa, holding a crystal wine glass filled to the brim with a dark red liquid she clearly could not appreciate. She was laughing loudly at a joke Jamal had just made, completely oblivious to the impending collapse of her entire existence. She believed this house was her new personal sanctuary, a guaranteed prize won in a fictional war. Her arrogant laughter grated against the pristine acoustics of the room. But sitting directly across from her, rigid and silent in an armchair, was Trent. He was a portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. His skin possessed a sickly, translucent pallor, and beads of cold sweat shone vividly under the dramatic lighting of the chandelier. He clutched an empty tumbler, his knuckles bone white. He knew exactly what I had done to his brokerage firm, yet he clearly lacked the courage to tell his wife that their millions had vanished. He stared at me as I entered the room, his eyes wide, resembling a condemned man watching the executioner now silently approach. I ignored the trembling broker and shifted my gaze toward the hallway. A sharp metallic snapping sound echoed from the direction of my private home office. I bypassed the living room entirely, moving with deliberate, measured steps toward the source of the disturbance. The heavy oak doors of the office were thrown wide open. Inside, a woman I had never formally met was currently invading my personal sanctuary. Brenda was standing in the center of the room, her back to me, wearing a cheap, extremely ill-fitting dress and aggressively snapping a bright yellow metal tape measure against the wall. She was speaking loudly over the booming music, completely unaware of my presence in the doorway. She announced to the empty room that the built-in mahogany bookshelves needed to be immediately demolished to make room for her oversized vanity mirror. She enthusiastically declared that the dark, sophisticated aesthetic of my workspace was entirely too depressing and required a complete floor-to-ceiling renovation. The sheer entitlement radiating from her every movement was truly fascinating to witness. She genuinely believed she had successfully replaced me, proudly measuring the dimensions of a room she assumed was now her permanent ultimate prize. I leaned gracefully against the doorframe, watching her perform this ridiculous pantomime of domestic ownership. I did not raise my voice or demand that she drop the tape measure. I simply waited for her to turn around. When she finally spun on her heel, the bright yellow tape zipped back into its plastic casing with a loud, startled crack. Brenda froze, her eyes widening as she recognized me from the countless photographs scattered throughout the house. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words materialized. Her arrogant confidence completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a sudden, incredibly uncomfortable, heavy silence. Before Brenda could formulate a coherent excuse for trespassing in my private office, Jamal strutted into the hallway behind me. He was practically vibrating with misplaced triumph, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of manufactured dominance. He held a thick, folded document in his right hand, wielding it like a legendary weapon. He walked straight past me, positioning himself protectively in front of his frozen mistress. He looked me up and down, a smug, contemptuous smirk stretching widely across his face. He actually believed he possessed the upper hand, entirely convinced that this ambush would finally break me. Jamal cleared his throat, projecting his voice so Keisha and Trent could hear him from the adjacent living room. He formally welcomed me to his newly claimed property, his tone dripping with fake hospitality. He proudly announced that they were currently celebrating the ultimate divorce payout. He stated that since I had ruthlessly stolen his corporate trust fund access, he was simply taking his rightful compensation in real estate. He waved the folded paper in the air aggressively, demanding my full attention. He declared that I was looking at the original property deed explicitly bearing his own legal printed name. He launched into a passionate, rehearsed monologue about marital equity and shared assets. He haughtily informed me that the laws of this state were incredibly clear regarding joint tenancy. He boasted that half of this multi-million-dollar estate belonged exclusively to him, and since he controlled 50% of the property, he possessed the absolute right to invite anyone he wanted to live inside these walls. He wrapped his arm tightly around Brenda, pulling her close to emphasize his absolute victory. He told me I could either accept my new roommates or pack a bag and leave here immediately. Keisha suddenly appeared in the hallway, joining the spectacle. She stood beside her brother, swirling her wine glass and nodding in enthusiastic agreement. She sneered at me, stating that the days of me looking down on their family were officially over. She promised that this house was going to be a lot more fun without my strict corporate rules ruining the atmosphere. Trent remained completely hidden in the living room, absolutely refusing to join the confrontation. The air in the hallway was thick with their toxic combined arrogance, an intoxicating cocktail of greed, spite, and profound, truly spectacular weaponized stupidity. I stood perfectly still, allowing their insults and grand declarations to wash over me without leaving a single mark. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to lunge at Brenda or attempt to snatch the useless piece of paper from Jamal's hand. They desperately craved an emotional breakdown to validate their hostile takeover. I refused to provide them with any emotional reaction whatsoever. I turned away from the trio, walking with smooth, unhurried steps toward the expansive gourmet kitchen. My absolute lack of panic confused them, breaking the aggressive momentum of their carefully planned, dramatic ambush almost entirely today. I opened the glass door of the built-in beverage refrigerator, the cool air washing over my face. I bypassed the remaining bottles of vintage wine they had not yet plundered and selected a tall, elegant glass bottle of imported sparkling water. I reached into the upper cabinet, retrieving a heavy crystal highball glass. I could feel their eyes burning into my back as I moved methodically through my pristine kitchen. I poured the effervescent liquid into the crystal, the sharp popping sound of the carbonation filling the quiet void left by my total silence. I took a slow sip. I turned back to face them, leaning comfortably against the cool marble edge of the kitchen island. The dramatic under-cabinet lighting highlighted the sharp angles of my tailored business suit. I offered Jamal a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. The kind of smile a predator gives right before it strikes. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his armor of delusion. I placed my crystal glass gently onto the marble counter, the soft clink echoing clearly. I reached down and picked up the heavy, secure legal folder I had carried from London today. I held the dark folder with both hands, my fingers tracing the smooth, embossed texture of the cover. I looked directly at Jamal, my voice barely above a whisper, yet commanding absolute, undeniable authority. I told him that his speech about marital equity was incredibly moving, but profoundly outdated. I informed him that the printed piece of paper he was currently waving around like a victory flag was nothing more than an obsolete historical artifact. I explained that in the world of high-level corporate finance, circumstances change rapidly, and ignorant people are always the very last to know everything. I slowly opened the heavy folder, the stiff paper crackling loudly in the tense, silent room. I pulled a crisp, newly certified document from the back pocket. It was the formal, irrevocable quitclaim deed he had blindly signed 2 years ago to secure his cryptocurrency loan. I held the devastating document up to the light, ensuring the official county recording stamp was perfectly visible. I informed Jamal that he did not own half of this house. I told him he owned absolutely nothing, and his unauthorized illegal trespassing party was officially permanently and spectacularly coming to an end right tonight, right? I watched the arrogant smirk on Jamal's face falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He lowered the useless piece of paper he had been waving around like a victory flag and stared at the certified document in my hand. He blinked several times, his eyes darting between my perfectly calm expression and the crisp legal seal stamped on the bottom corner of my folder. Brenda stopped admiring the walls of my home office, her tape measure dangling limply from her hand as she sensed the sudden drastic shift in the room's atmosphere. Keisha lowered her crystal wine glass, her triumphant laughter dying in her throat. The thick, suffocating silence in the hallway was entirely different from the quiet I had enjoyed in my London suite. This was the deafening silence of impending doom. I stepped away from the kitchen island, closing the distance between myself and my estranged husband. I did not raise my voice or break my terrifyingly serene composure. I spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a seasoned executive finalizing a hostile acquisition. I acknowledged that when we first purchased this magnificent suburban estate 4 years ago, his name was indeed proudly printed on the original deed. We were a married couple building a future, and placing both of our names on the mortgage paperwork was standard operating procedure. He nodded slowly, clearly hoping that my acknowledgement of this basic historical fact somehow validated his current ridiculous claim. He puffed his chest out again, preparing to interrupt me with another loud declaration of his marital rights. I raised a single finger demanding his absolute silence, and he instantly complied. I reminded him that historical facts were irrelevant when superseded by subsequent legal actions. I asked him to think back precisely 1 year ago to a period when his lavish lifestyle and his secret expenditures had vastly exceeded his modest corporate salary. I painted a vivid picture of his financial desperation during that specific quarter. He had been drowning in undisclosed credit card debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth for his friends, his toxic family, and evidently his hidden mistress. His eyes widened, and the remaining color rapidly drained from his face as he realized exactly which dark chapter of our marriage I was about to expose to the entire room. I turned my attention briefly to Brenda, who was suddenly looking at Jamal with narrowed, suspicious eyes. I informed her that the man she thought was a wealthy, powerful catch had actually been completely broke 12 months ago. I explained to the silent hallway that Jamal had formulated a remarkably stupid and highly illegal plan to solve his severe liquidity crisis. Behind my back, without whispering a single word of his intentions to me, he had approached a secondary lending institution. He had attempted to quietly take out a massive second mortgage on our primary residence. He wanted to pull hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure cash equity out of our home to fund his secret, pathetic double life. Keisha gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth, but I ignored her theatrical display. I kept my gaze locked on Jamal. I detailed exactly how the secondary lending institution required both homeowners to sign the extensive application paperwork for the new mortgage. Since he was actively hiding this massive financial maneuver from me, he could not simply ask for my consent. So he made the most catastrophic decision of his entire miserable existence. He took a blue ballpoint pen, sat at the desk in my private home office, and deliberately forged my signature on the official bank documents. He submitted those fraudulent papers to the lender completely unaware of the massive digital footprint he was leaving behind. I let the weight of the word forgery hang heavily in the air. I saw Trent physically flinch in the adjacent living room. As a licensed broker, Trent understood exactly what that meant. I explained that forging a signature on a major loan application with a federally insured bank was an entirely different level of criminal stupidity. I stated clearly and coldly that Jamal had knowingly committed federal bank fraud. He had handed a major financial institution a stack of fraudulent documents carrying mandatory federal prison sentences. He had risked everything we owned for a quick cash payout. I watched Jamal swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as the memories of his monumental failure washed over him. I continued my surgical explanation, my voice perfectly level. I reminded him of the morning the bank's fraud department flagged the application due to signature inconsistencies and immediately contacted my corporate office for verification. I told the room how I had intercepted the inquiry, quietly killing the loan application before the bank could officially alert the federal authorities. I had walked into our house that evening and confronted him with the rejected paperwork. He had fallen to his knees, begging me not to turn him over to the police, crying that a federal conviction would destroy his life. I looked at Keisha, who was now staring at her brother in absolute disgust. I explained that I had offered Jamal a highly specific lifeline that night. I told him that the bank was demanding immediate legal separation of our assets to prevent further fraudulent attempts. I convinced him the only way to shield him from a federal investigation and protect the house from government seizure was to immediately transfer the entire property deed into a protective corporate entity. I had spun a brilliant, terrifying narrative about aggressive bank auditors and federal prosecutors. I told him he needed to sign a formal quitclaim deed, legally transferring his 50% ownership directly into a newly formed, limited liability company. Jamal had been so paralyzed by the fear of federal prison that he did not ask a single intelligent question. He did not hire an independent lawyer to review the paperwork. He was blinded by panic and overwhelming relief that I was supposedly saving him from his own criminal actions. He eagerly followed me to a notary public the very next morning. I described how his hands had literally shaken with gratitude as he quickly signed the quitclaim deed, officially surrendering his entire claim to the suburban estate. He believed he was hiding his assets from the government. He genuinely thought the corporate shell game was a temporary measure to keep him safely out of a federal penitentiary. I opened the legal folder, completely extracting the certified documents from the state corporate registry. I held them up, displaying the bold black ink for everyone to see. I announced the name of the Protective Limited Liability Company that currently held the absolute uncontested deed to the property. I then read the official articles of incorporation aloud. I informed Jamal, Brenda, Keisha, and the terrified Trent that I was the sole proprietor, the exclusive managing member, and the absolute owner of that specific corporate entity. There were no shared shares, no hidden partners, and absolutely no marital overlap. The corporation belonged entirely to me, which meant the magnificent suburban estate they were currently standing inside belonged entirely to me. I turned my attention back to Jamal, whose smug, arrogant smile had completely vanished. The color was entirely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly grayish pallor. I spoke with brutal, unyielding clarity. I told him that he did not own a single square inch of this property. I explained that for the past 12 months he had not been a homeowner. He had been nothing more than a month-to-month residential tenant living inside a house owned by my private corporation. I stated that since he possessed no formal lease agreement, he possessed absolutely no tenant rights, no equity, and no legal authority to invite anyone onto the premises. I looked at Brenda, who had dropped her metal tape measure onto the hardwood floor. I smiled at her politely. I suggested she stop planning her new bedroom renovations because the actual owner of the property was formally demanding her immediate departure. I turned to Keisha, advising her to put down my expensive vintage wine and start calling moving companies for her unemployed husband. I informed them all that this pathetic divorce payout party was officially over. Jamal opened his mouth, his face contorting with desperate, furious denial. He raised his hand, preparing to scream that this was a trick that he would fight me in court. He never got the chance to speak a single word. Before Jamal could force a sound from his throat, the sudden heavy thud of multiple work boots sounded loudly on the wooden planks of my front porch. The aggressive synchronized stomping completely shattered the tense silence of the hallway. The imposing silhouette of broad figures blocked the ambient light streaming through the frosted glass panels of the front entrance. A second later, the brass doorbell rang with a sharp, piercing, and authoritative chime. The sharp, piercing chime of the brass doorbell severed the tense atmosphere in the hallway. Jamal froze, his mouth hanging open in denial, while Keisha and Trent exchanged panicked glances from the living room. I did not hesitate. I turned my back on my estranged husband and walked calmly toward the grand entryway. I reached the heavy oak door, grasped the polished brass handle, and pulled it wide open. The cold evening air rushed into the foyer, bringing with it the harsh, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the driveway. I stepped gracefully to the side, pressing my back against the wall to clear the path. Standing squarely on my front porch were two massive, heavily armed sheriff deputies. Their uniforms were impeccably crisp, their utility belts loaded with the heavy equipment of law enforcement, and their expressions were carved from absolute unyielding stone. They stepped over the threshold simultaneously, their heavy tactical boots thudding against the imported hardwood floor with deafening authority. The sheer physical presence of the deputies instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Jamal immediately snapped out of his shock and fell back into his most comfortable, pathetic habit. He decided to perform. He assumed the flashing lights and armed officers were simply the result of a noise complaint filed by one of our wealthy neighbors. He pasted a wide, incredibly fake smile across his face and strolled confidently toward the front door. He raised his hands in a gesture of friendly surrender, chuckling loudly as if he were greeting old friends at a sports bar. He told the officers there was no need for the heavy artillery, promising to turn the music down right away. Jamal continued his embarrassing performance, attempting to charm the officers with excessive familiarity. He called them brother and told them he completely understood they were just doing their jobs. He offered to grab them a bottle of water from the kitchen, acting entirely like the undisputed king of the castle, magnanimously addressing his humble subjects. The two deputies did not smile. They did not relax their posture. They did not accept his casual invitation. They stared at him with cold, clinical indifference. The lead deputy, a tall man with sharp eyes and a graying mustache, stepped forward and completely ignored the extended hand. He held a thick clipboard against his chest. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of amusement. He demanded to know if the man standing in front of him was Jamal Harrison. Jamal blinked, his fake smile faltering slightly as the aggressive reality of the situation began to penetrate his thick skull. He nodded slowly, confirming his identity while attempting to maintain his arrogant posture. The lead deputy did not miss a single beat. He stated in a loud, clear voice that they were not responding to a noise complaint. He announced that they were officially present to execute a lawful eviction order on behalf of the property owner. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Jamal physically recoiled, taking a clumsy step backward. His eyes darted wildly between the stoic deputies and my perfectly calm face. He stammered, demanding to know what kind of ridiculous, vindictive lie I had told the police to get them to show up at his house. I pushed myself off the wall and stepped back into the center of the hallway, looking Jamal directly in the eyes. I told him I did not tell the police a single lie. I explained that the legal machinery currently dismantling his life had been set into motion exactly 30 days ago. I watched his face contort in profound confusion as I laid out the exact timeline of his destruction. I reminded him of the morning I packed my bags and flew to London for my corporate restructuring project. I revealed that on that very same morning before my flight even departed the runway, my legal team had officially filed the divorce petition with the county court. But I did not stop there. I explained that simultaneous to the divorce filing, the private holding company that legally owned this estate had formally served him with a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I watched his eyes widen as the memory clearly clicked into place. I reminded him of the thick, certified envelope he had received in the mail 3 weeks ago, the one he had likely thrown directly into the trash without opening, assuming it was simply an empty legal threat or standard divorce paperwork. I informed him that ignoring legal correspondence does not magically nullify its strict legal power. I stated clearly that the corporate entity had demanded he vacate the property, and the legal clock had been ticking down every single second he spent living inside my house. Today was exactly day 30. The deadline had officially expired at 5 in the evening, perfectly coinciding with my flight landing. I had timed his removal with absolute flawless precision. He was no longer a resident. He was an illegal trespasser occupying a corporate asset without permission, and the county sheriff was here to physically remove him from the premises. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed Jamal. His arrogant bravado shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. He looked toward the living room, desperately seeking validation from his sister, but Keisha was utterly silent. She had backed away from the sofa, her face pale, her wine glass completely forgotten. Trent was already moving toward the front door, slipping on his coat with frantic, cowardly speed. Trent understood the finality of a court-ordered eviction executed by armed deputies. He knew there was absolutely no argument to be won here, and he was abandoning his brother-in-law without a single word of support. The lead deputy stepped past Jamal and unclipped a thick stack of papers from his heavy clipboard. He thrust the documents directly into the chest of my husband, forcing him to take them. The deputy stated that the paperwork included a finalized non-negotiable eviction order, signed directly by a county judge. He instructed Jamal to read the signature carefully if he had any remaining doubts regarding the legality of their presence. The deputy then delivered the ultimate devastating ultimatum. He announced that Jamal and all of his unauthorized guests had exactly 1 hour to gather their immediate personal belongings, pack their bags, and permanently vacate the property. The deputy warned that if anyone remained inside the house after the 60-minute deadline expired, they would be placed in handcuffs, forcibly removed from the estate, and formally charged with criminal trespassing. The ticking clock had officially started. Brenda had been standing completely silent near the entrance of my home office, watching the entire devastating sequence of events unfold with growing horror. The sudden absolute realization that her new luxurious life, her massive bedroom renovation, and her entire financial meal ticket had just vanished into thin air violently broke her composure. She had banked her entire future on the fake wealth of my husband, and the abrupt destruction of her parasitic dream triggered an explosive, unhinged reaction. Brenda completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the high, vaulted ceilings. She threw her bright yellow tape measure across the hardwood floor, the heavy metal casing shattering against the baseboards. She stomped down the hallway, her face twisted in pure, irrational fury. She yelled that she was absolutely not leaving this house under any circumstances. She screamed that Jamal had explicitly promised her the massive master suite upstairs, asserting that she completely deserved it, and she vehemently refused to be thrown out into the cold street like common, worthless trash. She hurled vicious, incoherent insults at me, entirely blaming me for intentionally and maliciously ruining her perfect stolen life just to satisfy my own bitter, vindictive desire for personal vengeance. Brenda violently stormed directly toward the main staircase, desperately trying to reach the upper level of the grand estate before the officers could legally stop her. She wildly threw her arms out physically, stepping directly in front of the two massive, heavily armed deputies, attempting to block their path to the master bedroom with her own body. She screamed that they had absolutely no right to touch her things. The second deputy never flinched. He did not raise his voice or attempt to negotiate with the hysterical woman currently blocking his path. He simply dropped his hand to rest heavily on the thick black utility belt at his waist, his expression hardening into absolute terrifying ice. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and delivered a cold, stark, and utterly devastating warning. He told Brenda she had exactly 3 seconds to step out of his way, or she was definitely leaving this property tonight in heavy stainless steel handcuffs, fully charging her with criminal interference and deliberate trespassing on my private estate immediately. I followed his instructions exactly. I remained completely composed, refusing to give them the dramatic, unhinged reaction they craved. I poured the imported sparkling water, took a long, refreshing sip, and placed my crystal glass precisely on the center of the kitchen island. I smiled a cold, terrifyingly serene expression and smoothly pulled a completely different, infinitely more powerful document from the back pocket of my leather folder. I placed it flat on the marble counter, smoothing the crisp paper with my manicured hands. I spoke in a clear, unwavering tone, informing Jamal that the property deed he was holding was entirely obsolete. I explained that when he had desperately attempted to forge my signature on that massive secondary mortgage application exactly 1 year ago, he had committed federal bank fraud. I detailed how I had intercepted the application and offered him a temporary lifeline to avoid prison, convincing him to quietly sign a quitclaim deed transferring his entire ownership directly into a protective corporate entity. He had eagerly signed away his rights to save himself, completely unaware that I was the sole proprietor of that discreet corporation. I stated plainly that he did not own this estate. He was merely a month-to-month tenant living in a house owned by my LLC. Jamal's smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly. His face drained of color as the horrifying reality of my words finally penetrated his thick skull. Before he could scream, before he could launch into a furious denial, heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed loudly on the front porch. A second later, the brass doorbell rang with a sharp, authoritative chime. I completely ignored Jamal's panicked expression and walked smoothly out of the kitchen, moving with elegant, deliberate purpose toward the grand entryway. I reached the heavy oak door, grasped the polished brass handle, and pulled it wide open. The cold evening air rushed into the pristine foyer, bringing with it the harsh, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off my driveway. I stepped gracefully to the side, pressing my back against the wall to clear the path. Standing squarely on my front porch were two massive, heavily armed sheriff's deputies. Their dark uniforms were impeccably crisp, their utility belts loaded with heavy equipment, and their expressions were carved from unyielding stone. They stepped over the marble threshold simultaneously, their heavy tactical boots thudding against the hardwood floor with absolute deafening authority. Jamal immediately snapped out of his shock and fell back into his most pathetic habit. He decided to perform. He foolishly assumed the flashing lights and armed officers were simply the result of a noise complaint filed by one of our wealthy neighbors. He pasted a wide, incredibly fake smile across his face and strolled confidently toward the front door. He raised his hands in a gesture of friendly surrender, chuckling loudly as if he were greeting old friends at a local sports bar. He told the officers there was absolutely no need for the heavy artillery, promising to turn the loud music down right away. He attempted to charm them with excessive familiarity, calling them brother, and offering to grab them bottled water from the kitchen. The two deputies did not smile. They did not relax their strict posture. The lead deputy, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward and completely ignored Jamal's extended hand. He held a thick clipboard against his chest, his voice resonant and devoid of amusement. He stated in a loud, clear voice that they were not responding to a minor noise complaint. He announced that they were officially present to execute a lawful eviction order on behalf of the property owner. The words hung heavily in the air. Jamal physically recoiled, taking a clumsy step backward. His eyes darted wildly between the stoic deputies and my perfectly calm face. He stammered aggressively, demanding to know what kind of ridiculous, vindictive lie I had told the police to get them to show up at his house. I pushed myself off of the wall and stepped into the center of the hallway, looking Jamal directly in the eyes. I told him I did not tell the police a single lie. I explained that the legal machinery currently dismantling his life had been set into motion exactly 30 days ago. I watched his face contort in profound confusion as I laid out the exact timeline of his destruction. I reminded him of the morning I packed my bags and flew to London. I revealed that on that very same morning, before my flight even departed, my legal team had officially filed the divorce petition. Simultaneous to that filing, my private holding company had formally served him with a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I watched his eyes widen as the memory clicked into place. I reminded him of the thick certified envelope he had received in the mail 3 weeks ago, the one he had likely thrown directly into the trash without opening, assuming it was simply an empty threat or standard divorce paperwork. I informed him that ignoring certified legal correspondence does not magically nullify its strict legal power. I stated clearly that the corporate entity had legally demanded he vacate the property, and the clock had been ticking down every single second he spent living inside my house. Today was exactly day 30. The deadline had officially expired at 5 in the evening, perfectly coinciding with my flight landing. I had timed his absolute removal with flawless precision. He was no longer a resident. He was an illegal trespasser occupying a corporate asset without permission. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed Jamal. His arrogant bravado shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. He looked toward the living room, desperately seeking validation from his sister, but Keisha was utterly silent. She had backed away from the sofa, her face pale, her wine glass completely forgotten. Trent was already moving toward the front door, slipping on his coat with frantic, cowardly speed. Trent understood the finality of a court-ordered eviction executed by armed deputies. He knew there was absolutely no argument to be won here, and he was abandoning his brother-in-law without a single word of support. The lead deputy stepped past Jamal and unclipped a thick stack of papers from his heavy clipboard. He thrust the documents directly into the chest of my husband, forcing him to take them. The deputy stated that the paperwork included a finalized, non-negotiable eviction order signed directly by a county judge. He instructed Jamal to read the signature carefully if he had any remaining doubts regarding the legality of their presence. The deputy then delivered the ultimate devastating ultimatum. He announced that Jamal and all of his unauthorized guests had exactly 1 hour to gather their immediate personal belongings, pack their bags, and permanently vacate the property. The deputy warned that if anyone remained inside the house after the 60-minute deadline expired, they would be placed in handcuffs, forcibly removed from the estate, and formally charged with criminal trespassing. Brenda had been standing completely silent near the entrance of my home office, watching the entire devastating sequence of events unfold with growing horror. The sudden absolute realization that her new luxurious life, her massive bedroom renovation, and her entire financial meal ticket had just vanished into thin air violently broke her composure. She had banked her entire future on the fake wealth of my husband, and the abrupt destruction of her parasitic dream triggered an explosive, unhinged reaction. Brenda completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the high vaulted ceilings. She threw her bright yellow tape measure across the hardwood floor, the heavy metal casing shattering against the baseboards. She stomped down the hallway, her face twisted in pure, irrational fury. She yelled that she was absolutely not leaving this house under any circumstances. She screamed that Jamal had explicitly promised her the massive master suite upstairs, asserting that she completely deserved it, and she vehemently refused to be thrown out into the cold street like common worthless trash. She hurled vicious, incoherent insults at me, entirely blaming me for intentionally and maliciously ruining her perfect, stolen life, just to satisfy my own bitter, vindictive desire for personal vengeance. Brenda violently stormed directly toward the main staircase, desperately trying to reach the upper level of the grand estate before the officers could legally stop her. She wildly threw her arms out physically, stepping directly in front of the two massive, heavily armed deputies, attempting to block their path to the master bedroom with her own body. She screamed that they had absolutely no right to touch her things. The second deputy never flinched. He did not raise his voice or attempt to negotiate with the hysterical woman currently blocking his path. He simply dropped his hand to rest heavily on the thick black utility belt at his waist, his expression hardening into absolute terrifying ice. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and delivered a cold, stark, and utterly devastating warning. He told Brenda she had exactly 3 seconds to step out of his way, or she was definitely leaving this property tonight in heavy stainless steel handcuffs, fully charging her with criminal interference and deliberate trespassing on my private estate immediately. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated my driveway and swept the parasitic infestation from my property. The transition from that chaotic night to my current reality has been nothing short of magnificent. I sit comfortably in my newly redesigned home office, breathing in the quiet, absolute peace that now permeates every single room of my estate. The heavy mahogany bookshelves that Brenda once threatened to demolish stand tall and polished, framing the large window that overlooks my manicured rear gardens. the oppressive toxic energy that used to suffocate this house has been entirely eradicated. The loud arguments and constant financial anxiety have been replaced by the serene hum of my central air conditioning and the soft classical music playing from my sound system. I take a sip of my dark roast coffee, savoring the rich flavor, and turn my attention back to the glowing monitors on my expansive glass desk. My financial portfolio is currently displayed across the screens, the upward trending green lines telling a story of spectacular growth and absolute security. Without Jamal constantly draining my resources, siphoning off cash for his hidden lifestyle and making disastrous decisions, my wealth has skyrocketed. The blind trust continues to compound aggressively, and my corporate investments are yielding unprecedented returns. I am completely independent, entirely untouchable, and firmly in control of my own destiny. The contrast between my current altitude and the absolute rock bottom my former family members now occupy is truly a fascinating study in consequences. The high society circles of our city are small, and gossip travels with lightning speed among the financial elite and corporate professionals. I do not have to seek out updates on their misery. The satisfying reports of their spectacular downfall are frequently delivered directly to my inbox. Mutual contacts and former colleagues who watch the entire drama unfold are always eager to share the latest developments. Jamal is currently experiencing the brutal, unforgiving reality of the working class he always believed he was superior to. He is no longer masquerading as a wealthy suburban elite. He is currently employed at a massive, brightly lit electronics retail store in a dying strip mall on the outskirts of the city. He wears a bright blue polo shirt and a plastic name tag, spending his days attempting to sell extended warranties to aggressive, highly impatient customers who completely ignore him. The true poetic justice of his situation lies in his paycheck. When he secretly racked up massive amounts of credit card debt to impress Brenda and fund his double life, he foolishly opened all those accounts entirely in his own name. He falsely assumed my corporate salary would always be there to bail him out. Now his creditors have aggressively and successfully sued him. His wages are heavily garnished by court order before the money even hits his pathetic checking account. He takes the public bus to work every morning because he has absolutely no vehicle to drive there anymore. He was completely devastated when he realized the luxury sport utility vehicle he drove was leased entirely under my holding company. The deputies had confiscated the keys from his trembling hand that night, leaving him completely stranded. He now lives paycheck to heavily garnished paycheck, completely crushed by the weight of his own profound stupidity. The situation with Trent and Keisha is perhaps even more deliciously disastrous. Trent failed to salvage his imploding brokerage firm. The catastrophic financial losses he suffered completely wiped out their entire safety net, leaving them drowning in severe corporate liabilities and massive personal debt obligations. Keisha was abruptly stripped of her country club memberships, her luxury shopping accounts, and the elite status she used to relentlessly mock me. The resulting financial pressure instantly destroyed the fragile, superficial foundation of their marriage. They are currently locked in an incredibly bitter, poverty-stricken divorce. They are viciously fighting over the remaining scraps of their shattered life, dragging each other through the mud in public court filings. Keisha moved out of their foreclosed suburban mansion and was forced to rent a tiny, depressing apartment. She no longer has the energy or the resources to maintain her arrogant facade. The harsh reality of having absolutely nothing has completely broken her spirit. Trent is facing potential investigations by financial regulatory boards, his professional reputation completely ruined. The perfect family they always pretended to be has completely imploded, leaving behind nothing but resentment, overwhelming debt, and shattered egos. Brenda also received a massive dose of brutal reality. She believed she had successfully stolen a wealthy, powerful king. She truly thought she was upgrading her life by invading my home and staking a claim on my estate. Instead, she tied her wagon to a broke, deeply indebted retail worker without any savings. The grand illusion shattered the very night the sheriff deputies forced them out into the cold street. Brenda is currently living in a cramped, noisy, poorly maintained apartment complex situated next to a loud industrial highway. She no longer brags to the neighborhood about her king. She no longer boasts about the luxurious future she thought she had secured. The crushing realization that she blew up her own life for a man who possessed absolutely zero assets and zero prospects has left her incredibly bitter and thoroughly humiliated. She works long, exhausting shifts at the local corporate pharmaceutical sales office. She returns home every evening to a tiny box where the walls are paper thin and the plumbing constantly leaks. She gambled everything on Jamal, and she lost in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Sitting in my pristine office surrounded by the physical manifestations of my hard work and strategic brilliance, I allow myself to fully absorb the depth of this victory. The intricate legal maneuvers, the strictly managed blind, trusts the discreet corporate entity holding the property deed, they were not just clever financial instruments. They were the absolute ultimate shield against parasitic greed and deceitful marital entitlement entirely. For years, I allowed Jamal and his toxic relatives to make me feel small. I tolerated their daily microaggressions, their constant entitlement, and their blatant disrespect, because I falsely believed that was simply the normal price of maintaining a marriage. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was significantly more important than protecting my own peace. I was entirely wrong. The exact moment I decided to stop playing the helpless victim and started treating my life like a high-stakes corporate merger, everything fundamentally changed. I recognized my own immense value and stopped accepting less than I deserved entirely. I understood clearly that my intelligence, my strong work ethic, and my sharp financial acumen were extremely powerful assets that deserved absolute protection. I stopped apologizing for my massive success and started ruthlessly guarding it from those who simply wanted to siphon it away. Cutting Jamal loose was the absolute most liberating action of my entire life. It was not merely a simple legal divorce. It was a complete systematic removal of a highly cancerous weight that had been actively dragging me down for years. I excised him from my bank accounts, from my property, and from my mental space. I performed this extraction with the cold, clinical precision of a veteran corporate surgeon. I did not let emotional manipulation or traditional societal expectations dictate my survival strategy. I utilized the strict letter of the law, the raw financial numbers, and my own superior intellect to build a massive, impenetrable fortress that they could not ever breach. There is an incredible, truly profound peace that comes directly from shedding useless dead weight. I no longer wake up feeling highly anxious about hidden credit card statements or deeply fearful of secret secondary mortgages threatening to completely destroy my pristine financial standing. I no longer dread obligatory holiday dinners filled with thinly veiled insults from a highly toxic sister-in-law who deeply resents my massive accomplishments. I no longer share my hard-earned private sanctuary with a weak man who views me as nothing more than a convenient automated teller machine designed to endlessly fund his deceitful, pathetic lifestyle. My beautiful home is finally mine. My immense wealth is finally mine. My incredibly bright future is finally mine alone. I stand up from my glass desk and walk smoothly toward the large window, feeling the warm morning sun spill across me. I look out at the beautiful estate that I entirely own, totally free and clear of any parasitic, fraudulent claims. The expansive grass is perfectly green. The open sky is a brilliant, totally cloudless blue, and the prevailing silence is absolutely golden. I successfully survived their malicious ambush. I brilliantly outsmarted their criminal fraud, and I flawlessly executed the ultimate, undeniable eviction. I have triumphantly reclaimed my personal kingdom, and the dark reign of the parasites is permanently, completely over. I smile warmly, turn back to my glowing financial screens, and happily get back to my incredibly lucrative corporate work.